All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth seminar in the Antarctic Futures event. I am Melinda Waterman from the University of Wollongong, and I will be hosting today's session on behalf of the Antarctic Futures organising team. This session will be recorded and will be made available on the Antarctic Futures website. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Dharawal country where we meet today. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So now I'm very happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Rachelle Balez, soon to be doctor, from the University of Wollongong. Trained as a scientist and artist with degrees at the University of Wollongong, Rachelle is currently completing her PhD at the Illawarra Health and Medical Research Institute on molecular mechanisms driving Alzheimer's disease. Beyond research, Rachelle often finds ways to communicate the beauty of science through art and has exhibited in several festivals or site art festivals and co-organised Magnified. So hopefully you remember Magnified from 2018, which was a Sci Art exhibition. Today we will be hearing about her leadership journey to Antarctica. So take it away, Rachelle.
Thank you, Mel. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. So I'd like to first start by saying a big thank you to the organisers of the Antarctic Futures exhibition and seminar series, not only for inviting me to present this evening, but also for putting on this exhibition, because I think it's a really beautiful celebration of the long-standing relationship that the artists and scientists of the Illawarra have had with Antarctica. Now, for those of you who don't know me, and as Mel just introduced, I am a neuroscientist. So you may be wondering, how did a neuroscientist end up in Antarctica? Now, it's a very valid question. So this evening, I'd like to take you through a bit of that journey. It really starts that when I was a child and show how it kind of ended up in an accumulation of science and art in the name of scientific leadership. So to start off, I'd like you all to indulge me for a sec and close your eyes, take a deep breath in and out, and think back to when you were a child. What were you curious about? What did your imagination run wild with? And what adventures did it take you on? What were you obsessed to find out more about? So just take a moment to find your inner child, as cliche as that sounds. Okay. So you can open your eyes, and the reason why I wanted you to connect with your inner child, because it was really in my childhood that my journey to Antarctica first started. If you asked 6-year-old Rachelle what she was obsessed with, there were two main themes that would often come out. One is Antarctica, and the other is dinosaurs. And you can really see that by how often they showed up in my childhood paintings and drawings. I'd continually spend hours looking through books and watching videos on Antarctica and dinosaurs to learn as much as I could about them. And so the reason why I wanted to show you these images is because for me, every child is a natural scientist and a natural artist. It's their curiosity for understanding the world around them, which at times can be, quite annoying because they continually ask them why? And then the way that their imagination can take them on journeys that they'll often express through their art, that it, for me, shows that children are all scientists and artists. Unfortunately, it seems that as we grow up, science and art start to drift apart, and they seem to be at polar ends of the spectrum. For me, though, it shouldn't be like that. For me, science and arts are two sides of the same coin, because they use creativity, imagination, and curiosity to identify and solve problems, just in different ways. So as I started to grow up, unfortunately, my dreams of going to Antarctica seemed to be a figment of my childhood imagination, but I did keep this love of science and art alive, even though quite often the education system made that quite hard because they seem to think it's mutually exclusive. I was fortunate that when I came to study here at UOW, I could do both a science degree and a visual arts degree. And even though I love them both, as I progressed through my science degree, I realized that I really wanted to focus on research. And part of the reason for that was that I recognized that I could use my natural curiosity that I'd had since I was a kid to help solve real world problems, which became really apparent when my Oma, who you can see here with me when I was like 1 year old or something, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is one of the most common neurodegenerative disorders, but unfortunately we have no treatments or cures for. Now, one of the reasons it's so challenging to treat Alzheimer's disease is being a disease of the brain. It's not possible for scientists like myself to access living human brain tissue to study. So to get around this problem in my PhD, what I've been able to do, and Zung, who is also in the audience, has been able to do, is we can take an easily accessible cell, like someone's skin cells, and then we can transform these skin cells into stem cells. Now, if you can't quite remember what stem cells are these incredible cells that are present at the very beginning of life. And what's so incredible about stem cells is they're like a blank canvas in the cell wall. They can grow into any cell type in your body. So what we do in the lab is we take the skin cells, we chemically transform them into stem cells, and then from stem cells, we can grow them into brain cells. So ultimately what this gives us is living human brain cells in a dish from someone with Alzheimer's disease or any other neurodegenerative disorder without actually having to cut out a chunk of their brain, which is a win-win for everybody. Now, what I hadn't expected as I went on my research journey was just how beautiful the molecular and cellular world is down the microscope. Pretty much every time I look down the microscope, I feel incredibly privileged to be able to see the inner workings of the cell. And here you can see what some of the brain cells look like when they're lit up with different markers for part of their sort of skeleton. Now, this has led me and my father, who I've collaborated with a number of times, as well as another artist, Mark Schwartz, to create sculptures that really capture and communicate this beauty of the molecular world. So here we created these like 2 meter high steel and ceramic artworks that were directly inspired from some of these images that I'd captured of the brain cells in the lab. Now, you may be thinking, what does all of this have to do with going to Antarctica? Good question. So as I continued on my science journey, there was a side story to being a woman in science that got harder and harder to ignore. And that centered around the roles of diversity and equity, or more, the lack of equity. Now, this isn't just a common issue for women in STEM, but as you can see from this graph of global leadership, for women across a lot of sectors, the women who are represented in orange only make up a tiny portion of the leadership on a global scale. Here is women in general academia. So it's even worse for women in science. Now, we all know there's a lot of reasons for these gender bias, from really confronting ones like sexual harassment and bullying, to the more subtle ones of conscious and unconscious bias, to the almost invisible ones of those systematic, deeply ingrained cultures that just stop women from progressing up the ladder. Now, I may be a bit biased by being a woman in science, but of course, I wanted to help affect change. And the reason I want to affect change in this as a woman in science is because, ironically, the science shows that when you have gender diverse teams, science is better. And the reason for that is because as scientists, we're working at this interface of the unknown. And the more different perspectives you have in this problem-solving capacity, the stronger and more robust your solutions are going to be. A really stark example of that is a number of years ago, there was these really horrific floods in Bangladesh. And straight away, the government team came in to rebuild emergency houses for everybody, but women weren't involved in that conversation. So the houses they built, believe it or not, didn't actually have kitchens. So that's just a very bleak and kind of shining example of how women need to be involved in decision-making processes across all levels. So this really motivated me to want to upskill so that I could help myself and others affect the change that we wanted to see in our different areas. And that led me to join and become a participant of the Homeward Bound International Leadership Initiative for Women in STEM, which I found out about thanks to Mel, because I'd been hassling her for years to try to get to Antarctica. I wasn't giving up on that childhood dream. And what Homeward Bound aims to do is it aims to upskill specifically women in STEM. Now, the reason they focus on STEM in the sciences is because many of the global problems that we're facing today, from climate change to the pandemic that we're still coming out of, we need science to underpin the policy and the strategy to get us out of these problems. They focus on women in science because women have very different leadership skills to men. And it's often shown that when we are in a position of power, the whole organization and the community health is also lifted up. So it's similar to the picture on the previous slide of let's help each other up the ladder rather than pushing down. Now, going to Antarctica is a really long way to go for a leadership course, basically. And it was one of the main questions that I would get when I found out I was going. Why are you going to Antarctica? Now, I couldn't answer this question despite how often I was asked it until I actually went to Antarctica. So on a sort of symbolic level, Antarctica is pretty special because it's the only continent that doesn't have a native people, and it is a continent designated to peace and science. So on that level, it seems like a fitting place for a global leadership initiative. But on a more real level, what I found in Antarctica is that Homeward Bound is trying to create this international network of women in STEM across all these different areas, thousands of us. And one of the strongest ways to make a network stronger is through connection. We know that from neuroscience. And there is something so powerful about being in one of the most isolated and raw places in the world and having this sort of out-of-life experience with these people you've only just met. And that really has strengthened a connection between us that I don't think we would be able to forge if the leadership course was held in like a conference hall like this. So while we were journeying,
I'll switch it up and
switch it on and off again. Can I just toggle on here?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So while we were journeying to Antarctica, we had the absolute privilege of being able to stop at a number of the scientific bases there. And this was such a unique opportunity to be able to see how scientific leadership played out in really isolated, high pressure, and emotionally charged landscape. And as we traveled to all these different bases that would range from Argentinian bases to American bases to UK bases to Chilean bases, you'd see all these different leadership styles play out. But it was interesting because they always had to put their international politics aside. Because if you find yourself in the middle of an Antarctic winter and you've run out of fuel, you really want to make sure you're on speaking terms with the neighbour, because getting fuel for survival is a little bit different than just trying to get sugar from your neighbour when you're building a cake, making a cake. So it was really interesting that when we, in particular, when we went to the Chinese base, in that in all the other bases, we'd often bring a gift. So from the Australians, it was Tim Tams. From the British, it was usually tea. Each nation sort of had a snack that we would bring to give to the people that are living in these really remote places. And we'd often get a tour around the facility and get to meet and talk with the scientists. When we went to the Chinese base, however, we weren't allowed in any of the research facilities, and we couldn't bring any gifts because that was perceived as a potential source of international bribery. So that was a very interesting thing to kind of encounter, how the Chinese in particular would be balancing this sort of geopolitical tie that they had to home with this intense and raw environment that they had down here in South. And to maintain that balance required a very keen kind of skill set of leadership. One of the common themes, though, that came across all the different bases that we visited was the importance of building trust and resilience, as well as respect within these teams, because people needed to know that they could talk to each other, be vulnerable, but also hold their own back when they needed to knuckle down. Now, these were key themes that our program really tried to instill with us. One of the foundational things we did was establish ground rules. There was 80 of us on this ship to Antarctica from over 20 different nations. And you can bet when you've got 80 women who are all highly educated and very passionate about what they do, sparks will definitely fly at some stage. So when we got into these heated discussions, we'd always come back to the collective ground rules that we had established day one to reset the circuit and make sure we remembered we were all working on this together. So this was accompanied by also identifying and spending time reflecting on our values, as well as our different learning styles for ourselves and others, because it's important to know what you stand for and why, and what other people may stand for and why, to be able to work within this diverse group. Another really important point that we learned about was visibility as scientists. If we really believe in the research that we're doing, we have a responsibility to share that with the general public. Now, on this point of visibility, we had an exercise we had to do where we all stood around in a circle, all 80 of us, and one by one, we went around and said what barriers we faced when it came to becoming visible as a scientist. For a lot of us, myself included, the thing we would say is our insecurities. We were our own biggest roadblock. But it was interesting that when it got to the Latin American climate scientists, some of them who you can see here, when they put their hand up, their biggest roadblock to being visible was that if they were visible in their field, they would likely be killed or their family would be killed. So that really is reflected in just these articles from the last couple of years, where the majority of environmental activists and scientists that are killed are in Latin America. And this is all to do with corruption around climate change. But it also was quite humbling and showed the privilege that many of us have as Western scientists, in that I can speak up and be visible, and the responsibility that comes then to use the platforms we have access to advocate on behalf of others who can't. And that's not just true for climate change, but in any workplace or any environment that we are in. If you have the privilege to speak freely and without consequence, you should be stepping up to do that. So it is hard. So from that, I hope you can get a little bit of a glimpse of the different things we were learning in the program and how the foundations are really set on identifying our own values and ways of operating and how to use that to be an inclusive leader. Now, I want to share with you a story that really kind of brings together what I call the 3 Ps, which are the people that were the participants within this program, the program itself, and then the place, which was Antarctica. Now, up until midway through our journey, it had been pretty much smooth sailing, both physically and metaphorically. And we were sitting about here in this really nice little sound. And we came back from one of our landings and we were asked to sit down because there was a decision that needed to be made. We had the opportunity to go to a really remote British research base down here called Rothera. Now, this was a once-in-a-life opportunity inside our once-in-a-life opportunity of already being in Antarctica. And the reason for this is because Rothera is so much further south than all the other bases, which you can see up here. Most other ships visiting Antarctica don't actually get to go there. There was an added element in terms of Rothera was only accepting 1 more visitor ship before it was shutting down for 2 years. So this was really, like I said, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The UK scientists in particular really wanted to go to Rothera. The catch, however, was that while we were sailing down here on the side of Antarctica, you're in really smooth and calm waters. It's glassy. To get to Rothera, because this sound was full of ice, we'd have to go outside the island and around the outside into rough waters. Now, this was a really polarizing point within our group because there was a portion of women on our ship that got really seasick. So for them, going to Rothera would mean that they'd have 2 days of feeling really bad and then another few days recovering from being so sick. So ultimately, they'd be losing out on 5 days or almost a third of the program. So we discussed this for about 45 minutes as a group. We had to reset on our ground rules multiple times because you had one side, women being like, once in a lifetime opportunity, we have to do this. And the other side, you've got women who are visibly shaking and crying because they're so scared of the pain and sickness they're about to go into. So to deal with this, we ended up having a blind vote, sort of representative of participatory decision-making. So how this worked is we're all asked to close our eyes. If you wanted to go to Rothera, you put your hand down. If you didn't really mind, you were neutral here. And if you didn't want to go, you kept your hands down. Based upon the blind vote, the decision was made that we wouldn't go to Rothera because too many of the women were going to feel sick. So similar to the approach we've taken with the pandemic, we won't go with the majority to protect the vulnerable minority. This didn't go down so well, and there was pretty much everyone was devastated for different reasons. The women who were gung-ho on going to Rothera were so disappointed. And because of that, the women who didn't want to go to Rothera were really sad because the disappointment that the other women had. Thankfully, though, we were in Antarctica, so it was incredibly beautiful and serene, and we all got in our zodiacs, and on a day that sort of matched our mood, we went around the beautiful sound and through the icebergs. We saw gorgeous pods of killer whales swimming around us. And it was a really powerful lesson in how when you've gone through an emotionally charged decision-making process, and even if you don't like the outcome, it's good to take time out to reflect, see where you are, what you're grateful for, and where you can go from there. Now, the Antarctic gods must have been smiling on us, because when we got back to the ship, we were told that there had been a change in the weather conditions, and the ship's captain had made an executive decision that we were going to go to Rothera. We could go around the outside, it wouldn't be too rough, and we could basically have our cake and eat it. So to show you just how excited some of the people were, here you can see Sarah Hamilton, which is a UOW researcher. She was stoked, along with most of us. There were a few that still got a little bit seasick, but I think ultimately from going through the participatory decision-making process and seeing the outcome of if we hadn't gone, they were able to sit in peace with the decision that had been made. The dramas weren't over yet though, because we still had to get back. And in the time that we were in Rothera, the conditions had worsened again. So our very adventurous captain then was like, okay, we've got this. Let's see if we can push and break our way through the ice that's blocking the sound. The only thing is, we're not an icebreaker. So it could be a Titanic moment. Me, who a pretty adventurous person, I was kind of oblivious to all of this drama. I'm just like, yeah, we're in Antarctica, this is awesome. And then slowly though, this sort of hush settled on the ship as it got darker and we really realized we are completely surrounded by ice. We'd up until that stage been able to go up onto the bridge and the deck with the captain and chat with the crew, and it was very relaxed. But all of a sudden, all the doors are closed and they are on high alert. They're standing at the edge of the boat, they're standing on all sides with binoculars, and they are using all of the skills and radios that they've trained for years to navigate us through this seemingly unnavigatable passage. So you can see our expedition leader, Greg, up there with his hands covering his eyes, and our captain and his crew looking out for ice. And I really wish I could capture the sound that accompanied this, because it was this continual kind of like grating and moaning and thudding as our boat weaved its way through the ice. So here's just another picture of the sea of ice that we pushed through. So this lasted all up about 24 hours. And it also gave us the opportunity though to workshop the whole kind of emotional journey that we had been on. How had we first reacted when we had this opportunity to travel south? Did we get really angry? Did we get really upset? Were we confrontational? Why were we feeling these things? And then why, when we were feeling these things, weren't we able to connect and listen to other people's perspective? And from that, there came out three key themes. The first was that difference between the participatory and unilateral decision-making, of giving people ownership of the decision they made, whether they like it or not, versus someone who has access to all of the information, just going for it and making it an executive decision on behalf of the whole. The really powerful role emotions play, especially in heated moments, and how that stops us being able to step outside ourselves and into the shoes of others to be empathetic and understand where they're coming from. And then also the challenges that come when navigating a diverse group and trying to come up with a win-win situation. Sometimes it's not possible, and the win-win ends up being a lose-lose. So even though icebergs were quite a source of drama for us, they were also one of the most beautiful things to sail in between. And there's something really humbling about being with these almost sort of like quiet, stoic giants that seem to have like their unique fingerprints of time etched into their side. There's something so, so beautiful and powerful about them. But it's really unfortunate because we are losing our icebergs at a rate of knots. And that really became apparent as we were going through the Weddell Sea on the other side of Antarctica, where our ship's progress was blocked by an iceberg that was kilometers long. And it initially had come up as a cloud on our ship's radar. Now, this iceberg had broken off from an ice shelf that made the news a couple of years ago because a chunk of ice the size of Manhattan, which is like 60 square kilometers, had broken off. Now, this is something that is continuing at an alarming rate of knots. And this news article is just from like 3 days ago, where they think that once this ice shelf breaks up, sea levels are going to rise 1 to 3 meters over 6 months, which if you're a Pacific Island nation is going to be pretty devastating. Now, the impacts of climate change were also seen on a lot of the wildlife that we saw. So here you can see some gorgeous chinstrap penguins as well as gentoo penguins. And a lot of these penguins are getting their nesting sites displaced because there's less ice and the food that is available for them isn't in their normal areas. So they're becoming overcrowded. Now, penguins are very curious creatures. And when you're in Antarctica, you're not allowed to approach the penguins, but they can approach you, and they do. They reminded me a lot of a curious child, where if you sat down, it wouldn't take long till a penguin would waddle along, and then they just sort of flop on you because your legs are nice and warm and you're like a big squishy hot water bottle. And then like a curious child, they sort of like snuggle up to you and hassle you for snacks. As these two here are biting my hand because they think I'm mum and I'm going to regurgitate some food or something. So seeing this parallel sort of between, you know, human children and penguins, it was really impactful for me in regards to how they're innocent bystanders of climate change. Penguins, the generations coming up now, they haven't done anything for the mess that we're currently in. So it's really up to us to help save them and empower them so that they can continue this sort of journey in helping the planet. Now, it was an absolute privilege to be in Antarctica, to just how close you could get to the wildlife. So here you can see a leopard seal, which for me looks a little bit like a velociraptor. And when you're in a boat next to a leopard seal, they're huge. They're like the size of this whiteboard or bigger. And you really get this like sort of eerie sense that you're no longer top of the food chain, which is not a feeling you get often, I feel like, as a human. And it was interesting because we could get so close to all the animals down in Antarctica, we started to get a little bit cocky and we're like, oh, but you know, we're experts now. I can tell the difference between a gentoo penguin and a Delhi penguin, and I know the difference between the seals and these birds. There was one evening where we're on the ship and we saw a seal that looked just like this. And one of the women kind of screamed because she thought it was a leopard seal that was chasing a lone penguin. We thought we were about to witness absolute carnage. It was like a car crash. You couldn't look away. Until one of the resident Antarctic mammal experts was like, that's not a leopard seal, that's a crab eater seal. They eat krill, not penguins, and it's probably lonely because they're social creatures and it just wants the penguin as a friend. So I think even though that was a very kind of comical situation, it was a good lesson in, you know, referring to the experts before you make an emotionally charged judgment on a situation. So it was in this way that Antarctica could show all these small little kind of leadership reflection points that allowed you to kind of contextualize your own reactions in different situations. Now, one thing I didn't anticipate though when I was in Antarctica was just how connected I felt at times to Wollongong and the beautiful coastline we have here. And what did it was the humpback whale. So I'm sure all of you at some stage has seen humpbacks traveling up and down our gorgeous coastline. And when they're migrating, they're either coming from or going to Antarctic waters. So every time I saw humpbacks down there, I felt like I was connected to our place back here. And again, that really impressed upon me the connectedness of our global ecosystems. And even though Antarctica is at the end of the world, it is still part of our global community. And it impacts more than just the creatures that live there all year round, like the leopard seal, but also the whales that visit from time to time. So from this, it really leaves the question of how do we engage people with science so that we can educate and impart positive action, so that we can tackle problems not just like climate change, but the pandemic and the need for diversity and tolerance within our broad international community. So of course, for me, one of my favorite ways to try to do that is through science and art. Big surprise there. And so I'd like to just share a little bit about this artwork that I collaborated with my father on again. And this one was called Curious Chromoscope. and it was these 2-meter high steel chromosomes. Now, what we wanted with this exhibition was to take you on the sort of paradoxically unique but universal aspect of the chromosome. So if you're not familiar with what a chromosome is, in every cell in your body, you have a copy of your DNA, and that's what makes you, you. But you get half of those chromosomes. So all that DNA is wrapped up in chromosomes. You have 23 pairs, and you get half from your mum and half from your dad. So I think they're a really elegant representation of how, even though we are all unique individuals, we are all connected to this larger global genetic community. And I think when you look at this sort of uniqueness and diversity, but similarity on a molecular level, it really highlights how we are all connected, even though we're different. And I think that's something that global leaders need to really embody as they try to get big groups of people from very different walks of life to enact change, whether it is for climate or the pandemic. Another good thing with this exhibition is that it helped fund my trip to Antarctica. So who would have thought that science would fund art? So when I came back from Antarctica, I was really inspired to keep connecting science and art. And so one of the ways I did, and Mel mentioned this in her introduction, was through co-organising with my friend and colleague Claire an exhibition here at UOW called Magnified. Now, this was a really special exhibition because we were able to take over 80 images from across scientists, the stretch of the Illawarra, and take their images that they would normally capture under a microscope and would be locked in drawers and you'd never see, print them up big and put them on a gallery wall. And from the funds that we raised from that exhibition, we were able to support early career researchers, one of who is in here, researching motor neuron disease in honour of Professor Justin Yerbury, who you can see here. So his lab researches motor neuron disease and he also has the disease. So it was really nice to be able to combine science and art and have a tangible impact on the scientific community by supporting young researchers. But one of the things I loved the most about this exhibition was seeing the scientists sort of for the first time see themselves as artists, as their gorgeous images were up on the gallery wall. And then also talking with the kids who came to the exhibition and hearing how their imagination interpreted these sort of otherworldly images. Again, really showing that all children are scientists and artists. So with that, I hope you can take away from this that for Antarctica to have a future and for humanity to really tackle these complex global problems such as climate change and the pandemic, we need global leaders that are diverse in their approach and their makeup, that are basing their policies on science. We also need to instill in the next generation, the children who will be taking up the baton, the curiosity of the scientists to ask why these changes are happening and the creativity of the artist to figure out how. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you and leave you with this picture of me living all of my childhood dreams, being a T-Rex in Antarctica. So thank you. Any questions?
Very nice and eloquent presentations, Rachelle. Thank you so much.
I should also highlight that I'm not the only one from UOW who has participated in the Homeward Bound program. We have been so lucky that along with myself, I went with Sarah Hamilton, the very excited Rothera goer that I showed you before. She's currently in the UK at the moment. And then every other generation, we have had other scientists from UOW. So it shows a really strong and great culture that we have here at the university of empowering women in science. And I hope that trend continues. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It was very good to acknowledge those people. And yeah, very eloquent presentation.
Thanks, Mel.
I loved it. So thank you very much. So we've got plenty of time for questions here in the room, and anyone who's online, you can post your questions in the Q&A chat space. So any questions in this room? Yes, Zoom.
I guess if you're willing to, what's the most surprising thing you learned about yourself in that journey?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I learned early on that a lot of my motivations throughout my life have been based on wanting to please others and wanting others' approval. And we did a really interesting diagnostics in the start of the Homeward Bound program, where you had a big kind of questionnaire where you self-assessed and then you gave the same questionnaire to your colleagues. And that was a way of identifying sort of your leadership or functioning styles. And it was interesting that for some people, they would think that they're really collaborative, and yet then all of their colleagues would kind of put the other and be like, they're a nightmare. So it was a way of identifying known areas of strength, unknown areas of strength, and areas of tension. And for me, it came up that I was very approval orientated. And why this isn't necessarily a good thing when it comes to performing a task is I don't necessarily do it because I want others' approval, but if I don't get it, it really knocks my confidence. So I'm always trying to seek for that gratification. What I need to learn to do, and it's hard because this is an operating mechanism I've had since I was a child, is instead of being approval orientated, is more achievement orientated. So I want to do the best job that I can, not because I want anyone's approval, but because I want to do the best job that I can, because that's where my inspiration and my passion lies. So I think for me, long term, that's been one of the hardest things to shift. But that's where I kind of reflect back on my core values, which took a really long time to identify. I'd never heard of core values. Coming from the science world, we don't really talk about them. It's much more corporate speak. But I think they're really important. And it took me, probably 3 years to land on 2. They said you should usually have 3. And so one of my core values is curiosity. And so when I'm in that stage of trying to seek someone's approval or feeling insecure because I'm getting criticism or not approval, I try to shift back to, I'm doing this because I'm curious and because I want the best outcome that my curiosity can give me. So yeah, it's an ongoing work in process.
Thanks for that, Shell. Georgia.
I'm wondering if you're working on any more science art projects. No.
Great question. Not directly, but I have a lot in my mind. And for those of you who don't know, I've submitted my PhD at the beginning of this year. So I'm just recovering from that process. It's been a time. But I definitely want to get back into that. I think I'll always be doing science and art, and I think I would really like to go back into sort of the sculptural work that I was doing with my father. When I work as an artist, I work in 3 dimensions. The way that I think, even though I did a lot of drawings and paintings as a kid, I automatically start wanting to build things with my hands. So I would love to make large-scale installations that really bring the microscopic world into the 3D, because there doesn't seem to be too much of that in the art world. So watch this space.
Andrea?
Can you describe some of the conversations that you might have had around the carbon footprint of the Homeward Bound program?
Yes, and that is a fantastic question. And it's a source of ongoing tension within the Homeward Bound community. So we were the second voyage to go. So there was one before us. And on our ship, it was a continual source of conversation because a lot of the women there were climate scientists. And they're like, look, we're grateful to be here and part of this program and going to Antarctica, but it's a bit sort of, counterintuitive and ironic that we're trying to advocate for the planet and yet we're leaving this huge carbon footprint going. So there were small things that we were doing, like offsetting our flights and trying to make the food as sort of less meat heavy. But there was a lot of criticism from a lot of the participants who were like, I think long term, if you want this program to be sustainable, then it shouldn't be going to somewhere as remote as Antarctica, or it should be held on a digital platform. So there hasn't actually been a voyage since the pandemic. And I think there is still discussion on whether the cohorts that have gone through the program but haven't been able to go to Antarctica do something else instead. To build on from that, one of the big challenges I have with the program comes down to privilege. So for myself, I was one of the youngest participants on the ship and as a PhD student, and there was probably about 6 or 7 of us but we all came from either the UK or Australia, because the trip had a $20,000 price tag. Now, the fact that me as a PhD student and my PhD scholarship is like, the cost of this trip is 75% of my annual income as a PhD student, shows how privileged I am to be able to fundraise that amount of money to be able to go. So when you look at women in developing nations across Latin America, even scientists in Spain where the income is significantly less than you get as a scientist here, they're like, we can't afford to go. So some of the women who we need their voice the most can't afford to go on this program. So they've been trying to develop up scholarships to counteract that, and initiatives to get more women from diverse and less, rich countries, for want of a better word. But I think that's two of the big problems that Homeward Bound needs to address, is the climate impact of going to Antarctica and the sort of financial privilege that is required to be a participant of the program. And watching that play out in the discussions within the program is really, really interesting, because it gets very heated. But I think that's a great example in, watching leadership in action and how they negotiate that space. Oh, good question.
That leads to a question that has been asked online by Anouk. Fantastic talk, Rachelle. My question is, did your Antarctica experience change or influence the way you approached your PhD research?
Yeah, definitely. It had a profound effect on my PhD research, in that the time in Antarctica, you're completely isolated from your life at home. And some women would call for like 2 minutes, family at home, because they had a young kid. But I made the hard calls, like social media blackout, email blackout, phone blackout. I'm here, I'm present, I'm in this space. And that made me really reflect of where I was at in my PhD, which was already close to overtime. And at that stage, I'd committed to a lot of different side projects. And the promise I made to myself as I was coming off Homeward Bound is I need to set really clear goals that serve my long-term goals, basically. Clear short-term goals for my long-term goals. And even though it took a while to wrap up all the side projects I had going when I came back from Antarctica, my partner's smiling in the background.
We won't count them.
It really made me focus and prioritize getting my PhD done. It took another 4 years, but we also did have a global pandemic. But it definitely made me clarify and reflect on the opportunities that come and identify where they're going to be worthwhile in the long term, and get better at saying no to things that weren't going to serve my long-term purposes. Nice
answer. Any other questions here in the audience? Yes, up the back.
I guess mine is connected to Andreas, and are you worried that having such positive experiences for something like a leadership program going to Antarctica, that it's going to become more popular in the future for other similar programs, or even tourism in general, to go to Antarctica, which then obviously can be devastating for wildlife and the carbon footprint?
Yeah, yes and no. So I do hope that it will become more popular, that we have leadership programs, but I think the sheer ambition of Homeward Bound and a lot of the complexities that have happened within the program will probably reduce the chance that other organisations will try to make something that goes to Antarctica. There has been a lot of conflicts within the group. It's not all, sweet sailing and, joyous journeys to Antarctica. There are really challenges and struggles that the organisation as a whole has to address and focus on. And part of that actually comes from the tension between, so the program came about as a dream by a corporate leader down in Melbourne, where she'd been at a conference on leadership, and she heard all these scientists speak by chance, and how they were continually kind of locked out of decision-making and career progression. So she was like, I need to fix something. She had a dream of all these women scientists in Antarctica. She contacted her friends, and then within like 18 months, the first ship was sailing to Antarctica. It was bold, it was ambitious, but that first trip wasn't executed the best. And they had to then do a big learning curve to get our ship off the ground and running. And again, much better executed, but still with challenges. And some of them were also to do with the mental safety of women on board this ship. When you have a whole group of people that are completely disconnected from their safety net at home, that can create quite a psychologically unsafe space, whether you are being open and supportive or not. And that wasn't very well supported on our ship. It's been better on subsequent ships. So I think all of these extra challenges that the program has had will probably, lessen the chance that other ships or programs will go to Antarctica. But I genuinely hope that there is more leadership in science and more leadership training in science. As a scientist myself, I so often don't feel equipped to be leading the group because I know how to move small volumes of liquid from one place to the other as I feed my cells, not how to lead a group. So that's why I think programs like Homeward Bound are so important. But I think in this growing climate emergency, it does need to focus on environmentally sustainable practices.
Any other questions from the audience here in the room? Any others online? Please post them into the Q&A chat space. If there are no further questions, I'd like everyone to thank Rachelle for sharing her lovely experiences, some good, some bad. But thank you again for being here, taking some time out of your schedule,
No, of course,
and sharing your stories. Thank you.